So first, I have to say that reconciliation, technically the definition is restoration of friendly relations. And I have to say that I'm all for the concept of reconciliation as relates to humanity's relationship with God. But I often speak of this as our work as a church. But since the traumatic events of the pandemic, and after hearing a lecture by Mark Charles about the doctrine of discovery and racial trauma, I've hesitated to use the word reconciliation. And I feel like I need to be precise. As a Black woman, as a faith leader, I don't have the experience of going about restoring something that was once whole. I mean, really, it's not. So I prefer to talk about conciliation. The act of resolving differences between two groups, it could be more, which is in legal terms involves a mediator who is usually, but not necessarily, impartial. As a Bishop of Vermont, I realize that I'm doing and leading both reconciliation and conciliation. And before I came to Vermont, boy, I thought I knew a lot. I thought I knew a lot about Vermont. And boy, did I had no idea. I was ignorant to a part of our history that I had known, and probably if I had known like the real details of it, I would not have gone to Vermont. So and I'll tell you why. When I read the profile about Vermont, I had no doubt that I was called there. And I did lots of research. I read things. I knew that Vermont is the second widest state in the nation. And now I have some idea of exactly what that looks like. About 645,000 people live in Vermont. More than a quarter of our state's people live in Chittenden County, that's where I live, where Burlington is located, while the rest live in small towns and rural areas. And I will say, Burlington is not a city, so we don't have any cities in Vermont, not one. About 89.8% of Vermonters are white, while less than 0.5% are Native American, and only 1.4% are Black. Asians make up about 1.5% of our population, and Hispanics are about 2.4%. More than 81.6% of our population is over the age of 18, which means that Vermont is not only just the second whitest state, it is also the second oldest state in the U.S. Even though Vermont was the first state to abolish adult slavery, and I said adult, more of the state's African American male population is in prison than on the street. Yes, Vermont's pride, I actually knew that before I went, but Vermont's pride at being the first to abolish adult slavery obscures the historical fact that some 18th century Vermonters enslaved children and took them to New York to be sold before they became of age and had to be freed. And I should say that, last year was when Vermont finally voted to take slavery off of the books, the legal books. Yeah. And then there's this. I knew this though. The eugenics movement flourished in Vermont in the first half of the 20th century and was supported by Bishop Booth, the fourth bishop of Vermont. And in fact, every once in a while I go and read it as he's introducing the head of the eugenics movement, who came and spoke at their diocesan convention. And the man started, well, naturally our common interest, and it's staggering. But anyway. And the movement, which culminated in a eugenics law enacted in 1931, called for sterilizing and institutionalizing indigenous people French Canadians, and people who were mixed race, poor, or disabled. I learned about this movement and its legal consequences by listening to stories of the ways the Abenaki people were targeted. And right before I came to Vermont for the discernment retreat, that's when people who are in the pool that they're going to pick from for the slate for bishop, we came for a discernment retreat. But right before that, Kaya Morris, the only black representative in the state legislature, had recently resigned her position because of harassment from white nationalists. Guns and all, yes. So I knew before I went to Vermont, I knew that all the clergy were white except for only one woman priest who was a Abenaki. I also learned that the Diocese of Vermont has a proud history of leading the way on matters of justice and inclusion. So yes, it's a strange mix. After scouring all the websites of all the congregations, I found that there were several congregations with anti-racism groups that met regularly. So nobody was watching, but this is what they were doing. They knew it was important. The 9th Bishop of Vermont, Mary Adelia MacLeod, was the first woman diocesan bishop in the Episcopal Church. So this, again, making history. My predecessor, Tom Ely, worked with others to advocate for marriage equality, both in the state and in the Episcopal Church. Vermont became the 4th state to legalize same-sex marriage and the first to do so by legislation rather than a court ruling. In the end, our mutual concern for conservation and creation care, exploring what it means to be church in an unchurched state, interest in new models of ministry, and a commitment to social and racial justice made me and the people of the Diocese of Vermont a really good fit. And then I was elected on the first ballot. And it wasn't like it was close even. They were certain that I was called to be their bishop. So clearly we were certain that God called us to share ministry in this time and in that place. With my election, I became the first black woman bishop of Vermont, the first black woman diocesan of New England, and there are 6 other black woman diocesan bishops, though, in the Episcopal Church, and also one other bishop-elect. Our experience in the Diocese of Vermont after my election was made even more complicated, though, by the fact that I became bishop, the first black bishop in that diocese history, at the end of September in 2019. And so you know what was coming, right? Less than 6 months later, we lost our ability to be in person. And so the ability to form strong relationships that we needed to navigate the transition to being a predominant, almost all white diocese led by a black woman. We just did not have some of the tools that we needed that are facilitated by being in person together. When I arrived in July of 2019, while I intended to pay attention to the work of racial reconciliation, I had no intention of it being a top priority. But after I arrived, in a passing conversation, someone mentioned the first bishop of Vermont, who was consecrated in 1832. And they assumed that I knew about John Henry Hopkins. I'll just say, in 1861, some of you might have heard this when I preached here before, but in 1861, John Henry Hopkins wrote The Bible View of Slavery, in which he criticized abolitionists and declared that there was no scriptural basis for ending slavery. And then, if one little pamphlet wasn't enough, there was an expanded version published in 1864, and the title of that is a scriptural, ecclesiastical, and historical view of slavery from the days of the patriarch Abraham to the 19th century, which included his argument from the biblical case for slavery, along with his critique of his peers. So I actually knew of Hopkins before this. In fact, I had talked about him in lectures about how the church's work of reconciliation is tainted by the presiding bishop who kept the church together because he was willing to stay in relationship and listen to the bishops who condoned slavery from the slave-owning states in the U.S. Hopkins was a presiding bishop in 1865. And I should clarify that back then, presiding bishops were not elected the way they are now. It was a matter of seniority and one serving and taking their turn. So in 1865 was also the year the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. And also, the Ku Klux Klan was also formed by veterans of the Confederate Army during the same time all of this was happening. And then Hopkins was intimately involved in establishing and designing the landscape of the University of the South, which is Sewanee, as a learning institution for Southern landowners. To this day, the university is owned by 28 Southern Episcopal dioceses. And then Hopkins used the money, and this is, it's odd that he would be, he was an artist, and so was I. I made a living as an artist. But Hopkins used the money that he made, he was paid for, to design this, the space at Sewanee to establish a learning institution in the Diocese of Vermont. And Hopkins' name is even on several important buildings in our diocese, including the facade of our school, Rock Point School, which is on the property where I live. So, and I remember vividly sitting in my living room, and the communications director just started talking about Hopkins. I was floored. And then after the day was over, my husband and I were talking through, what we had done that day. And there's two libraries in my residence, and the big one had a whole official library system. And he said he was taking books because it was all dusty and moldy smelling, and so we had to remove all the books. One of the things that he had done was taken a pile of books and put them in a box, and he says, "I saw this book, The Biblical, Ecclesiastical, and Spiritual Case for Slavery." I said, "Yeah, you don't say." Yeah. So as I began to ask questions about Hopkins, I was told how he was ahead of his time when he established our school, which at the time was a school for girls. And the chapel there has images of only women. The stained glass windows in that chapel are lovely. And one person also told me that Hopkins was a man of his time. So his ideas about slavery have to be viewed differently from how we think about slavery now. And I didn't know what to say to that. And I didn't say anything, actually. But I did think, abolitionists were also men of his time. And in fact, Hopkins and Absalom Jones was the first African-American priest in the Episcopal Church. And they were both ordained by the same bishop, William White. But Absalom Jones had been a priest for 20 years before Hopkins was ordained. They were Episcopalians, black and white, who certainly were people of that time and did not agree with Hopkins' idea. There were people in the Diocese of Vermont that didn't agree with him either. The first black parish of the Diocese of Michigan, established in 1845, St. Matthew's in Detroit, was at the mercy of a presiding bishop who did not care that the Fugitive Slave Act or Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 caused a growing congregation to stop worshiping and go into hiding. And 156 years later, I would become the rector of that same parish. Tangled web of the church. When Hopkins and his detractors were having conversations across difference, Black Episcopalians were not part of the conversation. You see, there were Episcopalians that thought, well, no, we really should not condone slavery, and those bishops and those people that would go to their conventions were having these conversations without key players in the matter. And instead of acknowledging deep division over the issue of slavery, Hopkins worked to keep the church together. When other denominations split, our church reconciled. Choices and compromises were made, and were being made at the expense of Black lives. This was not the work of reconciliation. Rather, it was the work of maintaining the status quo. The system, the institution, was created to support and privilege the dominant culture. So I think now you understand. This is part of my problem with the language of reconciliation, because too often when the church talks about reconciliation, the majority of people having these conversations are white men still, or others who are not impacted physically or emotionally by the consideration of compromise or conversations across difference. And when we are included, we are actually being asked to accept that our humanity and dignity is conditional, and it's based on the comfort or approval of others. And do you all use the term BIPOC? Okay.
Not so much. It's like for government forms, not for everyday speech.
Ah, I was wondering. I was curious. Well, we do. So, yeah. In the U.S., people do, in the church, everywhere. So, I will use, and I don't usually like acronyms, and it took me a long time to get used to that one. So, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community are individuals whom the church has been complicit in sacrificing on the altar of reconciliation. We are expected to carry the burden, to overlook the trauma we sustain from voices and views that don't value us for the sake of the big tent of the Episcopal Church. That's how it usually works. When the church calls itself to work at reconciliation, we have to realize that when we make unholy alliances at the expense of others, there will be long-term consequences. When we uphold false equivalencies, saying that all sides have validity, we do serious damage to individuals and communities. In fact, I have to say, recently our diocese went through a truth and reconciliation process, and one of the things that the facilitators kept saying was, there are, multiple truths and multiple ways to view the situation, but sometimes that's just not true. It's not courageous, and it's not faithful, and it's actually fear speaking and taking over when we do not name the fact that not everything can be seen from multiple ways. When the church doesn't do the work of reconciliation and conciliation that Jesus modeled, I tell you, we can certainly expect consequences. During the pandemic, as the U.S. faced so much racial upheaval and unrest, I became keenly aware of the energy it took to deal with microaggressions and innocent yet hurtful racial assumptions and comments. I am a mother a wife, a sister, a daughter. And I don't have the energy any longer, or the will, to coddle what a lot of people will call white fragility or innocence. I just don't. And I don't say that with malice. And sometimes it's hard. I mean, when I first said it, I thought, I'm going to make somebody uncomfortable. But I say that from the standpoint of wanting to have real relationships with people. Real relationships. And around the same time, members in my diocese also expressed their desire to focus on dismantling racism and white supremacy. And I'm going to make an assumption because to me it was, worldwide news. Everyone here is aware of George Floyd? Yep. Okay. Since I'm not in the U.S., I should not make assumptions. So after George Floyd was murdered, Episcopal congregations across my diocese began holding silent vigils and conversations about how to publicly state their support of Black Lives Matter. And in fact, the facade of Rock Point School, it says Hopkins Hall. I mentioned that earlier. And now there's a flag that's hanging. Now it's drooping a little, but it's a Black Lives Matter flag. And the juxtaposition of his name, which is somewhat obscured by that flag, it's a sight to behold. But anyway, during that time, the Diocese of Vermont formed an anti-racism action group. During Advent, we led a study of a scriptural, ecclesiastical, and historical view of slavery from the days of the patriarch Abraham to the 19th century. During Advent, yes, I figured if people are thinking about buying presents and things, why not talk about people buying and selling people? So when we started that study, that first evening, and I say 80 units because, on Zoom, there can be more than one person in a room, right? So 80 units logged into Zoom to learn about this part of our diocesan history. The English teacher from our school developed the study questions, and each session began and ended with a prayer offered from me. But I could not lead the discussions. It was beautiful, though, how all of this unfolded. It was very organic. I knew that when groups attempt to take on such an endeavor, the discussion leaders usually have all sorts of extensive training. But we didn't have all that training. We didn't want to wait. We couldn't wait. We weren't willing to wait for perfection, and we knew that we would make some mistakes. We had people who owned their lack of expertise and modeled how to go deeper. And each session included an introduction to anti-racism work, which helped people to stay engaged with and lean into the discomfort that was sure to be experienced. It was painful. We all wanted to look away from the Hopkins evil writing. My husband participated, and and every once in a while he'd say, I can't keep reading this. It's sickening. Personally, I struggled with the reading. It disturbed my spirit. As I read many, many times, I was sick to my stomach. And it pained me to realize how the legacy of compromise has caused trauma to me, my community, and the church, to everyone. But I was also struck by how many longtime Vermonters had no idea about Hopkins. And they expressed that they were ashamed that they didn't know. Because we're taught to try to see both sides of issues, people were conflicted about how to make sense of his writings. One person was so conditioned to giving credence to learned people and power, they decided that Hopkins was right about the Bible, and that since we know better, we can condemn slavery without turning to Scripture and our faith. I mean, every time I think of about that, Yes, he says, no, Bishop, no, it doesn't matter. Yeah, the Bible does say that, and it's okay. We can make a better choice. And I kept telling him, no, that's not true. Even when I, with the authority that a bishop holds in this church, even a person with multiple degrees explained that if we look at the teachings and ministry of Jesus, there is no case for slavery. That man continues to dismiss what I said to this day. Well, we completed our study of Hopkins' writing after the insurrection at our nation's capital. It was like maybe a week after that. And people made the connections between the unfinished and compromised work of reconciliation of the church. And since the last election, there have been renewed calls for the church to take up reconciliation with renewed focus. And I have to say, I've been suspect of those who are ready to move past those difficult months by launching into trying to understand or make room for the views that ultimately call into question the basic rights of people. And it's taken a while to overcome what we lost in the pandemic. The intersection of race and gender have been a major issue, which has impacted my relationship with some leaders in the diocese. A review of my ministry and the leadership of the diocese, it's called Mission Leadership Review or Mutual Ministry Review. But our Mutual Ministry Review, our Mission Leadership Review, documented this intersection as a risk and an opportunity for our diocese. The leadership review involved 48 diocesan leaders. And the leaders were interviewed by a consultant. So it's not like, the report that was generated was simply the opinion of the consultant. But leaders in their interviews said things to the consultant. And they're the ones that identified their concern about the negative impact of racism experienced by me and how it impedes our work together. Change, of course, has been a big part of my ministry. The church is an institution, not a surprise to anyone here. And being so, it isn't immune from the inertia and resistance that comes when we attempt to do what is necessary and faithful. We've had to face head-on the resistance of institutional and systemic racism. And none of this was a surprise to me because I've been living with instances of my ministry and the work of the diocese being undermined. My leadership and competency were also challenged. This has been a very, very difficult experience for my family and for me, of course. And I've needed to be vulnerable about that with leaders in the diocese in a way that hasn't always been easy. And also be clear about what is necessary for us to be in right relationship. But the most important thing is to focus on here is that we are coming through the difficulty as a stronger and more unified diocese with our focus on God's mission in Vermont and how we can participate in it. So, that's the end of this particular talk, and I don't really know what our time is anymore. Okay.
We have an hour for lunch after, so we've got time for questions.
Okay. So, are there questions? Well, I will say something about a question that someone else raised, and I'm going to be paraphrasing because he's not asking it, but part of the difficulty that I know people experience, and for myself as someone who has chosen to embrace my ministry of otherness, I know that there are times, and I allow myself to have people ask questions, to teach. And then there are times when I don't feel like it. And there are a lot of people that have been engaged in this work. And actually, I'm remembering last night when I was preaching, I said that I've been doing this work for 2 decades, but my math is wrong. It's been longer than that. And so sometimes you just get tired of why don't people get it? And, there's been a move in anti-racism work to tell people, do your own work and go read something. But then the struggle is, if people just read, then it's all intellectual. So how do you bridge that intellectual with, reality? How do you, how do you engage properly? But I can usually tell when no one's done any work when we're in conversations. And then sometimes I'll say something to someone and they'll tell me, oh, well, I've done my work. A piece of work, maybe, but I haven't ever said that, I promise, I haven't. But I have thought it, because it's a hard balance, and part of it, I think, that's difficult, and why, I will say that Black people or other people of color or, other marginalized groups will say, I can't teach you, is because they are fatigued. And because people want this work to be more comfortable than it actually is. It feels good to say, we're going to do this work. Yes, it does feel good to say that we're going to do this work. But the thing is that if you actually do it, it's hard, and you're not going to feel comfortable. And then there's also, and I mentioned already this, the thing of helping relationships and then level relationships. So all of that comes into it. And when we're talking about things being, the same, or, equivalencies, or there's both sides to both things, or you have to understand. Don't ask me to understand certain things. It's not appropriate. So that's where that comes from. And I don't really have an answer for how to get over that hump of people being tired and people wanting to ask questions. And I would say, don't be too hurt if someone says, go do your work. I don't feel like helping you. Don't be too hurt. They don't mean, sometimes they do mean it. Sometimes it's a lashing out because of whatever it is they've experienced. But don't just give up, because there are people who've taken that on, but sometimes then we do have to rest. And usually then I'm not around for somebody to ask me and, feel like I can't teach in some way. So.
Chris Berriger, thank you. Thank you, Dion. I was wondering what name to use. So, a question for you. I have a biracial family. Racism has been a common conversation for our family and struggle over the years. But we have a couple family stories of reconciliation, racial relationship healing that have been important encouragements in our family journey. Do you have stories of your own, presuming even your election as bishop is one, but do you have stories of that, of reconciliation, conciliation, healing, that have given you encouragement and strength in that, in the journey and in the struggle?
Yeah, there's so many, and my family is mixed, and when my husband and I were dating, he was nervous about what would his family think, and how is that going to work. And we broke up once for about maybe an hour. Because I said, look, those people are not going to be, they're not going to take care of you when you get old. they're not going to be around. They're not going to live with you. So they'll have to get over it. And so that was a thing with his family. And some of it was just being in relationship and people saying stupid things. And us deciding that we're together and going to be together and just getting past it. And my, I don't like to say things, I don't want to out anybody, but you know, someone asking me once in my husband's family, well, if you date Phil, then who are all the white ladies going to date? Well, it's like, he can only date one person at a time. Or, I mean, I guess he could date others. He could have. But then I remember another time, I mean, some years later, I mean, I don't know, we had probably been married for 20 some years by then, maybe 25 years. And it was a conversation I was having. It's crazy. We were on the way to Justice of the Peace so that I could witness my niece getting married to her spouse, so that then I could bless it. And she's a lesbian. And on the way, this is soon after, there had been some shooting of some black man somewhere. Choose a week, I don't know. And I can't even remember all of the conversation. And I was driving and I was speeding a little because trying to get there on time. And then I sped a little bit more because someone said something that was, inappropriate. And then my sister-in-law said, "Don't ever say that again." And I thought, wow, look at where we've come. And, but it was the relationships. My sister-in-law is, I love her and she fiercely loves me. And that happened over, some decades of time that we have that kind of love for each other and have seen each other through all kinds of things. But that's not where we started. And that's one of the places where I know, not everyone can have an interracial relationship, marriage, but that when that happens in families, that's where a lot of change happens because, it's like, what can you do? And not that there's not mistakes made, but that just breaks down a certain barrier that just, that's my family member now. Yeah. But there's so many stories. Yeah.
Can we hang up over there?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
do you want to hang up? Use the microphone, please. Tell us your name.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Veronica, and I agree with so much you said, Bishop, because as a black woman, evidently, I've had some of the same issues. And when you speak about the intersectionality of race and gender, I got it. Mm-hmm. So I just want to say I also was reflecting on things that Dion said earlier about the work that we have to do to bring people around to seeing what we're doing. And I say what we're doing because in my parish, we do have an anti-racism circle. And it was something that started, I would say that I approached my priest about back in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. So, and we have continued to this day. It's challenging, it's hard, and you have to sit in a lot of discomfort, as you have said, and that's what people have to be willing to do. And what I find that those people who don't look like me or other members of the BIPOC community we have to be willing, all of us, to sit in discomfort, because that's where the learning takes place. So I would just recommend that. It's not easy. And you mentioned the words white fragility as well. And that came to mind because of something that happened in my own parish. I won't go into details, but I think people have to understand that as people of color, we have been sitting in discomfort
Yes.
and experiencing it for many, many, many years, and we just got to trudge right along
Yeah.
through the mud and dirt and everything, but we keep standing.
Yeah.
And that's what I would just encourage everyone to try to do. What gives me joy and hope is the fact that many people who are non-BIPOC have actually come into the space of discomfort. They have listened, they have learned, and are now taking the appropriate action to be great allies. So that gives me a lot of hope. Thank you so much for your presentation today.
Thank you.
One last question, and then if you want to eat lunch, just say it.
Okay.
Well, if it's urgent, please bring it on.
Yeah, there we go. That's faith. Thank you again, Bishop. My father's family left Graham Singh, and I did say hello to the bishop already before, but hello again, Bishop. Sorry, thank you. Our family left India in the 1830s under a system of forced labor known as indentured labor for Guyana, and our family were involved in rice plantations and the Hindu faith. My father won one of 6 Ford Foundation scholarships to study medicine, and without that, our family would not have left planting rice. But whiteness was built in from that point. And I only began to learn about whiteness in that way from Dr. Myrna Lashley, who's also addressed us in this group in our journey that Bishop Mary's led us on over years now in these kinds of themes. My father also sat us down when I was about 14, and he said he had some important things to tell us. One was he hoped that we would not bring any children into the family outside of wedlock. That was his talk to the teenagers. And the other was, he said, I hope you all marry somebody a bit whiter than yourself, because I've tried so hard this far.
Yeah.
And that was a joke. That was a family joke until I started to understand what that really had meant for me and what it meant to be a person of color in a very white environment and to try to learn those things. My question for you, and maybe I could let you off the hook for answering it now, and maybe this is something you're already thinking of talking about, but I wanted to just name what I see as a fear. I'll just name it as my own fear. I think it might be somewhat shared. We've also had, during these conversations on Indigenous justice, on anti-black racism, at looking at broader issues of racism, we've talked a lot about the future of our diocese. And if we're not careful, it becomes very personal. I don't like what this person said, or this person's not leading us this way. When actually these things that we put on the list, we've talked about them before, and they're so hard to deal with that sometimes it almost seems like they've been swept away. And we have other lists like this that have come on PDFs after meetings, and then we're not quite sure what's happening with them. My question to you, and it's almost a benefit that you're right next to us, but maybe you don't know us a huge amount, is if you were just reinventing an entire diocese, for instance, maybe not this one, but just some general diocese, and let's just stick with North America, what are some of the things that you would have to name as systems that are definitely broken and are never coming back again? And what are some words of radical bravery you would give? And this is not an electoral synod. Bishop Mary's given enough time for everybody to think, but at the same time, we're all looking at our future. And so my question to you is, in the light of what you're saying, what prophetic guidance would you give us as we speak the truth, hear these things, and also as we try to set the stage for incredible, courageous leadership going forward? Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, that wasn't really the short version.
All right. So this is what I'm going to do. Because I know that, because that talk was longer than the first one and the next one. But I can speak to that in the next talk. But I want to get your questions more precisely here. Because I actually have I have a little like discussion piece for you all that fits nicely with that. Yes.
Do you want to write that down while I give them lunch instructions? Or are you going to answer now?
Yeah, well, no, I'm just going to have him
Okay.
write it for me.
Here's-
Yes, good.
So Graham, you're going to write your questions down for Bishop Shannon, because she would like to address them. Thanks so much. Everybody, we have to be back here in our seats at 12:40.